Hello, long time no see. How have you been? What's new? Have you seen any cool birds lately? I have. I saw a hummingbird sitting down right outside my window the other day. Never seen that before. They're always in motion when I see them, so that was pretty cool. But what's arguably even cooler is that we have finally arrived at the Triassic period, which lasted from 252 to 201 million years ago. The Paleozoic is over. Now we're in the first phase of the Mesozoic, also known as the age of the dinosaurs. The Triassic is often thought of as just the beginning of that, when the dinosaurs first evolved. But man oh man, was it much more than that, which is why it took me a month to research this video. There is a lot of shit to cover, because the Triassic came immediately after the most devastating mass extinction of all time that we know of. And so this period was a time of recovery and also a time of an explosion of diversity that can only be compared to that of the Cambrian. Yeah, this is nature's acid trip 2.0. So without further ado, my name is Lindsay Nikole, and this is the history of life on Earth that we know of. Before we get into it, I have an announcement. That's right, bitches, a merch announcement. The merch is back with some familiar faces like the snake tee and also some new shit like these mesh shorts, pins, which feature my son, stickers, which also feature my son, and last but not least, a boonie hat, which I got custom made to fit exactly like my boonie hat. You can get all of this now on lindsaynikole.com. Once again, that is lindsaynikole.com. Come get it while it's hot. Literally, this is all perfect for summertime. Thank you, that is all. Now back to the Triassic. Let's get the global conditions out of the way. As we know from last time, supercontinent Pangea is in full swing. And still is, until the very end of this period when it starts to break apart a bit. In the most general sense, generally, the most general form of generally, global climates in the Triassic were relatively warm, with little to no ice at the poles, and went from drier to more humid as time went on and Pangea started to break apart. Usually at this point, I maybe go more in depth on those points, set you up with some necessary context before we get into life of the Triassic. But this time it's a little bit different because of the mass extinction. We've covered periods that have followed mass extinctions before, i.e. the Silurian following the Ordovician, the Carboniferous after the Devonian. But neither of those were as catastrophic as the mass extinction that came right before the Triassic. You probably remember they call it the Great Dying, for good reason. 90% of all species went extinct and up to 96% in the oceans. Wiped out. This wasn't just gaps in the food web that needed to be reoccupied. This was entire ecosystems, from the bottom to the top, completely obliterated, all over the world. This was a global reset, using the bits and pieces that were left barely hanging on by a thread. A good friend of mine, who you might know as Paleo Analysis, has covered the Triassic on his own channel from a few different angles. He's also working on his own History of the Earth series that I highly recommend checking out. It is sick. So I figured it would be best for him to set up the context for the rest of this period, kind of give you a little preview of what's to come, some cool animals that are to come. I'm super excited to have him on in this video. He's actually the first collaborator I figured out before I even started working on this series. His approach to prehistory is really fun, and in his History of the Earth series in particular, he has these little characters that you watch and follow along with, and you watch them evolve as time goes by. It's just so cool. So if you haven't seen him already, I'm honored to introduce you to him, and I'm going to hand it to him now to set the stage for what's to come in this episode. Steve, take it away.
Thanks for having me, Lindsay. Hi there. I'm Steve from Paleo Analysis. Now, Lindsay's already talked about all the weirdness that has existed on Earth throughout the Paleozoic era already. And out of everything, I would say that probably the Cambrian is the most alien life has appeared. Until now. And if you think about it, the main reason why animal life would branch into so many different bizarre forms in the beginning of complex life that we know of, would be the same driving force behind life in the Triassic turning into things like this and this. And that force is adaptive radiation. Because there were so many vacant niches left by the missing flora and fauna that would eventually be filled by the survivors left to inherit the Earth. The Cambrian is such a big example of this because literally all the niches were getting filled by new organisms. Well, the Permian ended with the biggest extinction event our planet has ever endured. And we see in the Triassic that there are a lot of new groups arising to fill the roles left vacant by this catastrophic event. On land, the Sauropsids went from being one of the most dominant groups of vertebrates on the planet to being a shell of what they used to be, with one of the largest ones left being the roughly dog-sized Muscarinus, which was the last of the Therocephalians. Now, the reason why the Synapsids probably went this route, getting smaller, was because the post-Great Dying world was probably far less suited to endothermic mammal-like animals. During the first half of the Triassic, the majority of the land was mostly hot and arid. But as it turns out, this environment happens to work out much better for animals that get a large portion of their energy directly from the sun. And as a result, it is the reptiles that undergo the most adaptive radiation during this time. Now, when we talk about modern reptiles, we normally think of lizards, snakes, turtles, and crocodilians, and the tuatara, but I'm not going to talk about that. Hey, actually, this happens to be the perfect time to talk about that. Lindsay, talk about the tuatara. But during the Triassic, we see the beginnings of different families that don't fit into any classifications that we have today. Things like Tanystropheus and Placotis and Adipodentatus. Now, something that all of these butt babies have in common is that they were all responding to the Triassic environment by heading back to the coast and adapting to be semi-aquatic. Tanystropheus used its long neck and tiny head to feed on schooling fish, and Placotis used its battery of crushing tooth lumps to grind up the shells of invertebrates. And this direct ancestor of South Park's Jackophosor probably was a herbivore, using its wide, flat mouth to feed on algae and aquatic plants. And as bad as the Permian extinction destroyed life on land, it affected the oceans even worse. So it makes sense that there was a lot of creatures moving back into the oceans. And we see a few more that were becoming even more well adapted to this lifestyle, with marine pursuit predators like the Dinosaurs. And for those of you who look at this and say, well, that just looks like a big lizard, to that I say, well, yeah, but its name literally means false lizard, so you're wrong. This is actually a very unique creature. Its interlocking teeth, paddle-like feet, and streamlined muscular body were perfect for catching fish. Oftentimes, this animal has actually been compared to the reptile equivalent of seals. And this genus would actually become very successful and diverse, ranging from little guys around 80 centimeters or 2.6 feet long to the biggest Nothosaurus giganteus, which measured up to 7 meters or 23 feet long. This would have been enough to make the Nothosaurs the top predators of the Triassic seas, if it wasn't for one other group beating them to that spot. After 16 million years of the world being hot and dry, that was about to change. Around 234 million years ago, an event known as the Carnian Pluvial Episode would begin. An event that would completely turn the global climate on its head. This lasted around 2 million years, and is really the thing that marked the beginning of what the world would be like for a long time to come. The event is thought to have been triggered by the eruption of large areas of flood basalts. This pumped a large amount of CO2 into the atmosphere and triggered global warming, and this led to an unprecedented increase in humidity and rain. Which sounds good, right? Until you think about the fact that life has spent the past 16 million years adapting to the exact opposite. So, many of the animals that evolved in the first half of the Triassic didn't survive this event. And even more would happen at the end of the Triassic. Again, thank you so much to Lindsay for having me on. My name's Steve. This is Tim. Try your best to ignore him.
Hey.
And feel free to check out my channel, Paleo Analysis, where I talk about the history of life on Earth. Have a good one, everybody.
So, like we always do, we're going to go about this video in sections to make way for the main show. Kind of build up the environments, telling you what's going on in those, in order to place the major players properly. So, let's get into it. Starting off with the plants. As you will come to see, time and time again, throughout this entire series, seeds are very resistant to environmental stressors. They have a major leg up over eggs for that reason, like I mentioned before. Eggs suck compared to seeds. So, because of this, seeded plants like seed ferns and conifers were able to make it out, and were able to be present in the form of forests pretty early on into the Triassic, which turned out to be great for animals that were regaining their footing, as you will see in a bit. And as time went on, it was kind of just smooth sailing for them. They formed more and more vast forests, and fossil evidence suggests that some of the trees in these forests could get to about 100 feet tall, which you might be thinking, yawn, we've got redwoods and sequoias, so whatever. But considering this was so soon after the biggest catastrophe the world has ever seen that we know of, it's pretty impressive. Gotta celebrate the small wins too. Wait, I almost forgot. I wanted to show you one of my air plants. I have air plants up here, and I have other ones that are closer to my window, and one of them looks like this now. I think it's happy. It literally looked like these. It was all green, and then one day the leaves started turning red, and I was like, maybe it's because it's summer. Succulents do that too. I don't know anything about plants. But then all of a sudden, these two thick purple things started showing up, like kind of inside of it. I'm gonna be honest, the day I noticed that, I'd had a little bit of cannabis, and seeing those two thick purple things really freaked me out. Thought something was existentially wrong. You know, the whole song and dance. Turns out that it's happy and it's blooming, and I posted it on my Instagram because I was like, oh, I don't know what the fuck is going on. I've never seen an airplane do this. I guess it's ready to reproduce, and then it's gonna start dying, but some buds might come off of it that will be bigger than this one. So I'll keep you updated. Later in the Triassic, some of the more primitive plant groups that you might remember from before started to make more of an appearance again. Your horsetails, your club mosses, your liverworts. They were not only recovering, but it seems like they were thriving. Their presence suggests that the climate was becoming more humid, since they like when it is humid. They were definitely smaller than seed plants overall, but that didn't matter to the tiny little guys you might usually think of in the context of plants. They eat it. They find shelter in it. They are so small. Yeah, the insects. They love vegetation of all sizes. They don't discriminate. You know them. They're fucking all over it. Many of the key modern insect groups you might think of really started to establish themselves in the Triassic. A lot of them have origins that are found earlier, but then Triassic came, and boom, they are present. Such as Diptera. You might be familiar with today's flies. Also, Lepidoptera, the modern bisexual symbol. Yeah, moths and butterflies. And also Hymenoptera, today's bees, wasps, and ants. Yes, they are all related to each other. That might have made you kind of uncomfortable for a second when you think about it a little bit. Makes sense. And it's like, okay, now you're back to comfortable. Well, I'm gonna make it uncomfortable again for you. Bees and ants evolved from wasps, which means bees and ants are technically wasps. Yes. Heinous. I know. Also, I forgot to mention last time, beetles are a thing now too. They were since the Permian, that we know of, which is insane considering their existence is one of my favorite fun facts. Did you know 25% of all discovered animal species are beetles? 1 in 4 species we've discovered alive today is a beetle. That's about 350,000 species of just beetles. That's a shit ton of beetles. And if you decide to stick around and subscribe, you're probably gonna hear me say that about a dozen more times, if not indefinitely. Beetles rock. Okay, back to Hymenoptera. I want to talk about the wasps a little bit more, which sucks because I hate saying wasps. Bees and ants weren't a thing yet and wouldn't be for another handful of millions and millions of years. The earliest Hymenopterans were kind of the basic sawfly, just a few millimeters long, ate plants and minded their business. This was the earliest form of the wasp. Pretty cute. But at some point there was a shift to the more sinister style we're more familiar with, and it goes way beyond having a stinger that fucking sucks. It was the shift to parasitoidism. The development of the parasitoid wasp seems to have happened sometime during the Triassic. Parasitoids and parasites are pretty similar, but not the same. I know it sounds like I'm just trying to sound smart, but they are different things. You can kind of get the gist of what a parasitoid is based on what you know about parasites, but they are different things. So I'm going to make the distinction anyway because it's an important one. So, a parasite, as we are familiar with, is an organism that lives off nutrients obtained from a host, i.e. another organism, and usually causes harm but does not kill the host, because then the host is of no use. Some classic examples would be tapeworms, head lice, ticks, etc. You can kind of think of it as a lifestyle choice. Parasitoids, on the other hand, you can kind of think of as a parenting choice. They only use their host for a specific time in their life cycle, usually as children, and then eventually kill the host. That's the deal. They kill it. That's the whole thing. I'll give you an example. The tarantula hawk. The wasp you might be familiar with from Coyote Peterson's Sting series. The wasp stings a tarantula, paralyzing it. Not killing it, but paralyzing it. Lays eggs on it. The eggs hatch, and the larvae eat the paralyzed tarantula alive, taking nutrients from it and also eventually its life. That's what parasitoids got going on. Usually parasitoids people talk about are parasitoid wasps, but they can also be things like worms. There's a worm for everything, like the horsehair worms that we talked about in the What the Fuck Is This series. So to summarize, parasites are usually a lifestyle choice and don't kill the host. And parasitoids are usually a parenting choice and do kill the host. And parasitoid wasps seem to have evolved sometime in the Triassic. This became the dominant lifestyle strategy for hymenopterans until bees and ants evolved, and remains the dominant lifestyle strategy for wasps to this day. But luckily, that does not include yellow jackets and hornets. They're not parasitoids, their stings just suck. Another major development that happened for hymenopterans as a whole was the development of the snatched wasp waist. The first and second segments of the abdomen became constricted, which allowed for greater flexibility and maneuverability, and it's thought to have played a huge role in the diversification of wasps as a whole. Alright, let's move on by building up some context in the oceans. Like I had mentioned, they seem to have suffered a slightly more devastating loss than ecosystems on land did. The biggest blow was with the corals. Just to recap, corals are cnidarians, related to jellyfish, sea anemones, etc. One of the oldest animal lineages that we know of, and have generally existed as a kind of backdrop in marine ecosystems, especially the corals. Coral reefs literally define some of the most diverse ecosystems on the planet. It's hard to imagine the oceans without them. So with the major hit to the corals during the Great Dying, coming out of it, There were no reefs. I know. Depressing as fuck. Before the mass extinction, there were two main groups of corals, rugosa and tabulata. Extinction hit, then boom. No corals in the fossil record for something between 10 to 14 million years. It's what scientists call the coral gap. It's so significant in the context of this recovery that they have a name for it. Then sometime during the Middle Triassic, a more modern group of coral appears in the fossil record seemingly out of nowhere. The scleractinian corals. Where they came from? Scientists don't know. They could have evolved from rugose corals that somehow survived the mass extinction, or evolved from some anemone-like ancestor, but their origin remains a mystery due to the elusive coral gap. But remember, this was a time of innovation due to devastation, Croatian, crustacean, cetacean. It was a time of spreading out, rebuilding ecosystems quickly. And so in many groups, the survivors developed new abilities that can be seen in their descendants today, like new predatory strategies, like within gastropods that we know and love today as snails and slugs. Their Triassic relatives developed the ability to drill through the holes of their prey, allowing them to feed on the soft, delicious flesh inside. There were also some new abilities with the malacostricans that we know and love today as crabs, lobsters, shrimp, etc. Some of their ancestors developed the ability to snip through hard skeletons. And what do you know? Many malacostricans today love doing shit like that. What about vertebrates in the water, i.e. fish? I'm gonna be honest, they don't really come up a lot in general Triassic context. They're acknowledged very briefly, like, yes, there were fish, but luckily I did manage to find one formidable species to show you. A species that was described pretty recently in 2017 made news because their presence so early in the Triassic was unexpected. Bergeria americana. Sounds like mud. Bergeria americana. One of the earliest marine apex predators following the mass extinction that we know of. This fish was a clear-cut predator. The fossil had 3 rows of sharp, 2-centimeter long teeth in their massive jaws. And scientists have estimated they would have been about 6 feet long, which again, I know, doesn't sound crazy. Some of you are probably 6 feet long. But in terms of like the biggest catastrophe the world has ever seen that we know of, literally just happened. 6 feet for a fish is big. It was shocking. It was unexpected. This discovery suggests the apex predators evolved much earlier than previously thought, or re-evolved. A lot of what we know about Bergeria americana comes from Bergeria cousins that were alive all around the world later during the Triassic. They ended up becoming a classic fish in the global seas. So showing up even earlier than expected, more points to them. When you think of apex predator and fish, your brain probably goes to sharks. So let me give you a rundown on Triassic sharks. Honestly, it's a shitty update. It's very lackluster. The Triassic is when the more modern ancestors of sharks, skates, and rays started replacing the more primitive ones. That's it. And not entirely immediately, but it just kind of became noticeable here. That's all I really have to tell you. The Triassic fossil record does not really highlight any cool sharks, at least that I know of. Papers kind of just mention them in the most general sense and then move on. So, stay tuned for cool ones in the next episode. Now we're starting to enter the moment you've probably been waiting for. Creatures of the limbed variety. This is where shit starts to get weird, and we're just gonna take it one step at a time. Starting with the amphibians, who were obviously doing great throughout the later parts of the Paleozoic. And as early Triassic communities were rebuilding themselves, the remaining members were still there as some of the dominant players in these new ecosystems, specifically the temnospondyls, which came in a variety of shapes and sizes, and continued to diversify throughout the Triassic. You had your salamander-like builds, you had your crocodile-like builds, absolute tanks like Mastodonsaurus, the largest of which had skulls that were 4 feet long. Just the skulls. 4 feet long. There were also, you weird bitches are gonna love these, Plagiosaurs that had heads wider than they were long. I like them a lot, to be honest. They look like they're here for a good time, and that's it. Just flat and ready to fuck shit up. This is also when the ancestors to true frogs appear in the fossil record, also known as stem frogs, like Triadobatrachus, the earliest record of the frog shape. But again, not true frog. True frogs appear for the first time as full-fledged frogs. That is a tongue twister. Full-fledged frogs in the fossil record in the early Jurassic. So with the presence of Triadobatrachus in the Triassic, it's safe to say they evolved sometime in the late Triassic that we know of for now. Who knows? It could always be earlier. So, remember in the Permian, I talked about this kind of tug of war that has been going on between synapsids and sauropsids since they first really established themselves, and has gone on to this day. In the Permian, the synapsids had the upper hand. Their diversity was nuts, and they consisted of some of the largest and most dominant species in terrestrial ecosystems that we know of. Now, knowing what we know about the age of the dinosaurs, specifically from mainstream media, it probably won't surprise you to find out that throughout the Triassic, the Sauropsids started to get the upper hand. Both groups experienced big developments in locomotion, growth rates. The average size of both groups was larger in the Triassic than it was in the Permian, but the Sauropsids took over nonetheless. That will be very clear by the end of this video. Let's start with the synapsids, the ancestors to mammals. Our story kind of left off on them in the Permian, on Lystrosaurus in particular. They, along with other synapsids, were luckily able to make it out of the mass extinction extinction and paved the way for some developing traits that were moving closer and closer to what we think of as mammals today. Something they were obviously completely unaware of and was irrelevant to their existence. We are also moving closer and closer to a form that will be more familiar to something living 500 million years in the future, or maybe just 10 million, whatever. Evolution isn't directional, shit just happened that way. You know what the fuck I'm talking about. So back in the Permian, synapsids kind of had a mix of different postures, sprawling out, kind of like a lizard, which was the original form, and more upright, kind of more like a dog or a rhino, or any mammal alive today. The upright posture allowed for movement with greater speed and agility, and became the dominant synapsid form in the Triassic. It also seems like fur and whiskers must have developed here, if not earlier. I kind of mentioned potential whisker pits found in a cynodont from the Permian, but it was kind of iffy. The ancestor to the entire mammalian tree was alive in the Triassic, a type of cynodont, remember a specific type of synapsid, until different groups started branching out like monotremes, which are today's platypuses and echidnas. They branched off sometime in the early Jurassic. They have fur. And then marsupials and placental mammals, the true mammals, they have fur too. There's no reason to believe that mammalian fur evolved more than once, so it's safe to say that it must have developed sometime in the Triassic, as the common ancestor must have passed it down to the eventual branches. So, a lot of cynodonts in the Triassic are reconstructed with this in mind, resulting in something like this. Diademodon. Kind of looks like a mix between a dog and a wombat. Cute as fuck. Also, I like their name. Diademodon. 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 Sounds like Doug Dimmadome.
My name is Doug Dimmadome, owner of the Dimsdale Dimmadome.
Diademodon was alive between the middle to late Triassic period and got to between 3 to 6 feet long. They had robust skulls with large canines and closely packed cheek teeth, which indicates they were probably herbivores or carnivores. Which reminds me, I had something I wanted to say, but I didn't know where to put it, so I guess I'm gonna put it right here. I don't know if your brain works like mine, but when I think back to how I viewed animals as a kid, I guess I kind of thought of plant eaters as like the basic form, and then the meat eaters as the more advanced form, which led to a kind of foundational assumption that meat eaters must have evolved from plant eaters, or herbivores are the original trait and carnivores are the derived trait. Well, that's not really the case at all. And actually, the original trait among tetrapods on land was carnivory, and each group had members move to a more herbivorous lifestyle and accumulated traits in order to be able to do that. In the Permian, we saw a few different groups of synapsids do this, like Cotylarhynchus. They ate plants, and lots of them. Sauropsids too, like the pterosaurs. The vegetarian movement was already up and running. But there was definitely an even greater shift into herbivory following the mass extinction and into the Triassic, across many different groups. But anyway, you're probably wondering what happened to Listersaurus after the mass extinction. Well, held on for a while, but eventually went extinct during the early part of the Triassic. Like Steve said, there was a lot of shit going on, a lot against them. So, they were an evolutionary dead end. Sad. But that doesn't mean that some of their other dicynodont relatives all went with them. Because by the middle Triassic, there was a dicynodont that was about the size of a modern elephant walking the planet, called Lissavicia, which I kept pronouncing as Lisa-Wicia in my head when I was researching, but it's Lissavicia. I like my pronunciation better, but whatever. It's pronounced that way because the first fossil specimen found of it was in a village called Lissavice in Poland in 2005, and it was massive, about 15 feet long, 8.5 feet tall, and estimated to weigh somewhere between 13 to 16,000 pounds. So, about the same size as a large male African bush elephant, and about 40% larger than any previously found dicynodont, just absolutely demolishing the standard. So, that's synapsids. Now we're moving on to the sauropsids, the biggest section of this video. I'm gonna be honest, I had a really hard time figuring out how to organize this. I kind of wanted to do it like smallest to biggest species for the, the factor of it. But considering how drastically different early Triassic species were from later Triassic species, I thought that was going to be confusing because I wanted to make the distinction, like these are early Triassic, these are late Triassic. So I decided what I'm going to do is go through each section, and within each section, start from early Triassic to late Triassic. So that's how we're going to go about it. I think this was the best way to do it, but let me know, because I think shit is just going to become more complicated as time goes on with these series episodes. So, I'm gonna let you in on a little behind the scenes insider scoop. The outline for this video was so long that I realized that I was gonna need 2 days to film it. So I already set aside 2 separate days. This is day 2. And then day 1 went much worse than planned. So yesterday when I was filming, I got all the way up to like fish. I wanna say fish or sharks. I went from the introduction all the way to fish, and that took me a while. And then I realized, I looked at my camera and it said it wasn't recording anymore. So I was like, holy shit, when did it stop recording? Like maybe there was a storage issue. So I went back and saw that it cut off at wasps, and I was like, fuck. So the whole thing from terrestrial invertebrates to the fish, or even further than that, maybe amphibians, was just gone. So I was like, oh my God, I have to redo that whole thing. So I did that, and then I stopped. my day at the end of the Synapsids. So I was like, I am done. I need to pick up in a better mood on a better day. And then I sent everything to Gian, and he went through it, and he was like, hey, the first section was completely missing. And I had actually re-recorded the second half that I thought was missing, and what was truly missing was the first half. I guess I accidentally deleted it to free up storage after I watched it. Didn't think I did, but anyway, today's a better day. So now we're picking up where it should have left off, the Sauropsids. Like I mentioned earlier, the Triassic period is when the dominance shifts from Synapsids to Sauropsids. The Synapsids in the Permian have a fossil record that indicates they were much larger and more diverse than the Sauropsids, occupying more dominant roles in their ecosystem. Coming out of the Permian mass extinction and into the early Triassic, this is generally still the case. The dominant shift didn't happen overnight, and Synapsids still held relatively more significant roles in their recovering ecosystems, at least that we know of. But during this time, they must have been diversifying to shit, because by the Middle Triassic, they had become the dominant group in many communities and exploded in a level of diversity that a single lineage had never seen before this in such a short amount of time, taking over the land, skies, and seas, as I'll break down in a minute. But I want to start off by introducing you to a few miscellaneous species that came out of this explosion of diversity before we get to the major takeovers. Starting off with arguably the most flamboyant bad bitch of the Triassic, Longisquama, about 4 inches long and alive during the Middle and Late Triassic. Their most distinctive feature is obviously those blade-like structures coming off their back. What exactly they were used for is still a big mystery, but there are plenty of ideas. Some researchers believe this was an early experimentation with feather genes. They seem structurally and morphologically similar, and at one point in the 80s, some scientists threw around the idea that they could have helped them fly through the air or glide, but I don't think that idea had a lot of footing. Other researchers pointed out that these structures were too thick to be true feathers, so maybe they were just some other form of a elongated or modified scale. Others said maybe they were some sort of in between, distinct from both feathers and scales, which I guess I kind of already covered by saying a modified or elongated scale, but I digress. Whatever they were, there was definitely some weird experimentation with scaly features of these Sauropsids of the Triassic as they diversified. And this next one will prove to you that there was definitely some experimentation with overall proportionality as well. Trypanosaurus, some sort of demented rat chicken lizard from the late Triassic. Their body plan is unusual, to say the least. They're about 1 foot long and had a pretty massive set of claws, with one disgustingly larger from the rest. Looks like they stole it from a creature 10 times their size. They also had a thick, prehensile tail that also seems to have had its own claw at the end of it. What exactly they were is unclear. They were definitely different from dinosaur and lizard lineages. Nevertheless, this heinous body plan was perfectly adapted for living in the trees. The tree-dwelling lifestyle, using the claws to hook onto tree bark and maybe claw at it and pull little creatures outside of it, snack on delicious insects. Next, so, we all know turtles. We love them. They are so cute and have been around for a very long time, appearing sometime in the late Permian. I also forgot to tell you about them last time. The earliest turtle that we know of is Dinosaurs. Absolutely darling. They were about 1 foot long and, as you can see, had a kind of expanded rib cage, making it easy to imagine them as a step toward the classic turtle shape we're familiar with. Some of the more well-known Triassic turtles that we know of are Papachelis, Odontochelis, and Progenchelis, each having a different set of traits on their way to the true turtle shape. The shell, which is made up of the upper part, the carapace, and the lower part, the plastron, and a beak instead of teeth, etc. But the reason I wanted to bring turtles up here is because the turtle shape has evolved more than once, and there's a set of heinous representatives of this in the Triassic. So allow me to introduce you to my favorite, Henotus, a 3 foot long placodont from the late Triassic. As you would probably guess, Henotus seems to have had a similar lifestyle as turtles do today, spending most, if not all of their time in the water, since their limbs made walking on land a bit strenuous. But their shell was much more square and flat than of today's turtles. Just a preferential difference, I guess. Alright, next. Steve told me to talk about them, but I was already planning on it. So, the group that has just one single remaining member alive today, the Sphenodonts, like he mentioned, is represented by the Tuatara of New Zealand. I guess that we know of. Maybe there's more species alive from this group that we haven't discovered yet. I don't know. The Tuatara is sick. At first glance, they probably just look like a classic reptile, but they have 3 eyes. Yes, 3. The 2 classic ones, nice and big, you can see them, and then a third one on the top of their head that is much smaller. So in practice, it's probably just functional enough to maybe help them sense direction of light, maybe track the movement of the sun, maybe helps them feel more at peace with their spirituality, whatever. Sphenodonts in the Triassic were a pretty diverse group of little guys, and quickly achieved a really widespread distribution across the planet. So that's that. Those were the miscellaneous ones I wanted to talk about. Now, we're moving into the land, skies, and seas. And we're going to go in that order. So, Who took over the land in the Triassic? Yes, the dinosaurs. Covering the dinosaurs first. So the first thing to know about the dinosaur lineage is that it emerged from a larger group known as the Archosaurs. Archosaurs evolved into dinosaurs. Let me get my whiteboard for this. So, see if I can get it without the light hitting it. Okay, can you see that? Archosaurs first appeared sometime in the early Triassic. They first evolved as fish and flesh eaters. But later in the Triassic, herbivorous groups also emerged. This allowed the Archosaurs to occupy a wide range of ecological niches. And this allowed them to become the most diverse group moving into the middle and late Triassic, and eventually led to a split in the most general sense. So, you can think of, like, let's say this was surrounded by a tree, and then there's branches all over the place, and there's even some branches that don't really belong to either side of the split, but you can still kind of categorize them between the two. That makes sense. Like, maybe there's one, like, right there that's, like, barely on this side, but it's still on this side, technically. So on one side was ornithodyrents, also known as dinosaurs and pterosaurs, and the Crocodilians, also known as the Crocodilians. To keep it simple, I'm just going to use the common names. I don't want to say these words. I feel like Crocodilians is like the same issue as rural, you know? It's just like, ugh. So, dinosaurs and pterosaurs on one side, Crocodilians on the other. So, that's the context. Well, let's start from the beginning in the early Triassic. I'll show you some of the most memorable and or heinous representatives. Starting off with Pterosaurus, whose name means first crocodile or early crocodilian, but this wasn't the first crocodile. True crocodiles didn't appear until sometime in the early Jurassic, that we know of. But an early crocodilian nonetheless. Pterosaurus was about 11 feet long and kind of just looked like a distorted crocodile, or a crocodile on an acid trip, to keep in line with the theme of this video. The bones at the very tip of the upper jaw, or the premaxilla, were kind of downturned, so they looked like they hung over the side. And their head was naturally held upwards at a 17-degree angle. Fossil evidence of their brain cavity and structures within their inner ear suggests their auditory abilities were adapted for low-frequency sounds, which means they might have communicated with low-pitched vocalizations, if anything, which is pretty horrible to think about. By just looking at them, an early crocodilian, you'd probably assume they had a classic crocodilian lifestyle, semi-aquatic. That was the assumption for a long time. But more recent studies, kind of looking at their qualities as a whole, suggest they might have just been basic terrestrial, which honestly I think is much worse than semi-aquatic. This, on land, all of the time. I don't like it. We're gonna kick it up a notch with one that is just so horrific to look at. There is nothing I could do to prepare you for what this reconstruction looks like. It might be the worst one on the list. Erythrosuchus. Just grotesque. Looks like how a kid would draw T-Rex as a dog. So what happened here? What went wrong? Well, let's revisit what this creature was up against. A recovery from the most devastating mass extinction the world ever saw, followed by extinction aftershocks. The world was unpredictable in the most extreme sense, and one of the best ways to make it out alive of an unpredictable time is to live life like a relay race, rather than a marathon. Be born, grow rapidly, reach sexual maturity quickly, send the next batch out before you die and hope one of them sticks. Just send them out, 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 until eventually you got shit that looks like this, because you're in survival mode, so fuck it, send it out. Send it out, send it out, send it out. I know I'm kind of being mean because I'm making them sound pointless. That's not nice. It was obviously not the case. They actually seem to have been built perfectly for a lifestyle of an active carnivore. They had a robust skeleton, a massive skull that was armed with rows of sharp, menacing teeth, ideal for ripping into flesh. They got to about 15 feet long, with a neck that took up about 0% of that. And maybe I'm projecting. Their head is so large. Maybe I'm just being mean, because I know what that feels like. I'm projecting my own... I'm not insecure about it, but my head's fucking big. It's huge. That's why I have like 3 hats. I have a big head. I get it. All right. Next, Arizonosaurus. Right off the bat, you're probably thinking this must be the ancestor to Spinosaurus. No, not even close. For some reason, the sail was a fan favorite for multiple lineages. Dimetrodon had it, now Arizonosaurus, later Spinosaurus. Shit happens sometimes. And Arizonosaurus was just one of the few different archosaurs that had these tall neural spines on their back during the mid-Triassic. For what purpose? Could be a few things. Maybe thermoregulation like Dimetrodon, maybe sexual display, or species recognition. For our purposes, just another example of the weird shit that happened because of the Triassic explosion. Alright, next, Lotosaurus, another archosaur with a sail on its back, but a little bit different. This one's definitely more heinous than that of Arizonosaurus. I like this one a lot less. They look like they're in an uncomfortable position, you know? Like they could topple over at any moment. Makes me feel a bit uneasy. Instead of the classic jaws with teeth combo that we see in many other archosaurs, Lotosaurus possessed beak-like jaws, which suggests herbivory. They also had flattened ungual phalanges, which are the bones that support nails or claws. So they were probably very interested in digging or scratching or any other behavior you can think of that animals possess when they have claws and nails. Blvd is mostly known from a single monospecific bone bed, a site where the vast majority of the fossils found belong to a single species. It points to a mass mortality event. They all died together and were buried together. Maybe a herd all dying due to a severe drought, or maybe they were all manipulated into a cult. We can't disprove either possibility as of now. All right, next, definitely a fan favorite, Shringosaurus, 10 to 13 feet long and absolutely cool to look at. They had a pair of large, forward curving horns on their head that might have only been present in males, so maybe a sexual display thing or a tool for male-on-male combat, but more research must be done. They had robust bodies with elongated necks, possibly used in a similar manner as giraffes, browsing on vegetation at various heights, giving them a leg up in the competition. These are one of my favorites for sure. I just like what they got going on. You know, this right here is a good setup. All right, so moving into the late Triassic is when some of the first true dinosaurs start to emerge. One of the earliest known is Tawa, a simple and badass name. They were named after the Puebloan sun god because of where they were found in New Mexico, and they might have been one of the earliest theropods, which is the lineage that includes T-Rex, Spinosaurus, Velociraptor, species with that classic shape, you know, and one lineage of theropods evolved into birds. Separate from all of those that I just listed, they all had their own branches. T-Rex was not a bird, and I'll actually be covering that in a couple weeks because of some bullshit that keeps circling the internet after a Redditor said that T-Rex must have had wings because he flipped the arms upside down, and now people are saying that scientists have confirmed that T-Rex was a bird. It's not. It was not, but I'll cover it in a couple weeks. Anyway, this is a significant group, and Tawa might have been at the very humble beginnings of it. At 6 to 12 feet long, so much smaller than some of the descendants, but absolutely cool nonetheless. One species from the late Triassic that was on the crocodilian side of the split was Desmatosukis, a 16 feet long, heavily armored tank that had bony plates and spikes covering its body from head to tail. These served as formidable defense against predators, making Desmatosukis a difficult snack to indulge. But defenses like these don't evolve for no reason. Their existence suggests the presence of predators that were powerful, or at least almost powerful enough to rip them apart, like Smilosukis, another one on the crocodilian side of the split, in a group called the Phytosaurs. They had a maximum length somewhere between 24 to 39 feet, dude. Definitely one of the largest semi-aquatic predators of the time that we know of. They had massive skulls and a set of unusual teeth with tusks at the front to skewer their prey. Despite looking almost exactly like modern crocodiles, osteoderms and all, remember those skin bones, they were not the ancestors to crocodiles or even in the true crocodilian lineage. Just also on that side of the split. Another classic case of convergent evolution. The crocodilian form has worked for a variety of creatures in a variety of different ways. Alright, so that's the takeover on land, and a few semi-aquatics, but land section nonetheless. Like I said, there are countless other species that I could have included, so if I missed your favorite, tell us about it in the comments. And if you're interested in learning about other species, check the comments. Let it serve as a jumping off point. That goes for any section of this video or any other video in this series. But anyway, let's just keep the ball rolling. If you ask me, the most impressive development in vertebrates, in my opinion, was the evolution of sustained flight. Insects have been doing that for millions of years already. Yes, I definitely don't want to step on their toes. I mean, they zip around like nobody's business, and that is sick. Good for them. But the vertebrate evolution of sustained flight led to some of the largest flying animals the world has ever seen, that we know of. The beloved group, the pterosaurs, which again, were not dinosaurs, they just evolved alongside them. While true pterosaurs didn't evolve until the late Triassic, a few earlier species provide ideas of flight experimentation, like Scleromochlus, a small reptile from the late Triassic in what is now Scotland. They were very small, about 7 inches long, with much of that length made up of a long, slender tail. Scleromochlus individuals were built for running or hopping. They had a light, agile build, and their hind limbs were much longer than their forelimbs, a trait shared with early pterosaurs, hinting that they or a close relative could have been the true pterosaur ancestor. Maybe the running and hopping led to higher hopping assisted by small membranes to catch the air, which eventually led to sustained flight. Another idea is a more top-down approach rather than ground-up. Maybe pterosaurs evolved from gliders, like Chaerovipteryx. They had elongated hind limbs, with skin-covered membranes stretching between their legs and their body, allowing them to glide between trees like modern-day flying squirrels, or sugar gliders, etc. Regardless of where they came from, by the end of the late Triassic, the first true pterosaurs had appeared, like Eunomorphodon. They had a 3-foot-long wingspan and all the key characteristics of later pterosaurs, like elongated fourth fingers to support a wing membrane, a short tail, and jaws lined with needle-like teeth for for snatching up fish. And fish had a lot more than early pterosaurs to worry about, because we have arrived at the last big takeover, the seas. Sauropsids got productive during the Triassic. While you're probably familiar with some of the major groups that lived on throughout the age of the dinosaurs, I'm going to introduce you to a few randoms that give this second wave acid trip its infamous reputation. Starting off with one of my favorites, and one of the weirdest of the Triassic, Adipodentatus. I know, and this is a correction to the original reconstruction that they had of it. The first fossil specimen was found in 2014 in China. With the way it was preserved, the mouth kind of looked like a zipper going down the middle of its face. Since this was the only fossil they had to go off of, this is the reconstruction that they came up with. A vertical mouth that looks like their face was slashed in half. 2 years later, they found another fossil. And what do you know? The first fossil they found was fucked up and had been crushed sideways. So they did not have a vertical wound for a mouth. No. Instead, they had a hammerhead snout, arguably just as twisted. That mouth was filled with needle-like teeth they might have used to scrape shit off the seafloor. Let me know what you think. I like them very much. Alright, next, Tanystropheus, who had a neck like nobody's business. They actually have one of the longest necks relative to body size of any vertebrate that we know of, due to up to 19 hyper-elongated cervical vertebrae, giving it a neck that could be up to 3 times its body length. Those proportions don't make sense if you ask me. Their skull was wide and flat and was likely used for ram feeding, swimming through the water with its mouth open, like that, until something swam into it, and then snap, donezo. Their elongated neck might have allowed them to explore different depths and niches than other marine reptiles with normal-sized necks, which was great during this experimental phase. However, it also left them extremely vulnerable to decapitation, the guillotine's wet dream, if you will. While they definitely had the longest relative necks of the time, they were not the only ones with this elongated quality, because during the Triassic, the plesiosaurs appeared as well, a group that would live on to be known as the long necks of the seas. Why exactly this trait evolved multiple times is up for debate. One idea is the long necks allowed them to sneak up on their prey in murky waters. I guess if you imagine seeing the silhouette of their body from a distance, it would be perceived as much farther away, and you wouldn't be able to tell that within that silhouette is a head that is much closer to you. A heinous thought, if you ask me. Plesiosaurs would turn out to be much more successful than the extra-long Tanystropheus, and would live on far beyond the Triassic. It seems as though they had much stiffer necks and short, stiff trunks, making them slightly more difficult to decapitate, I would imagine. They also developed bonier joints in their wrists and ankles, rather than like cartilaginous, so within their flippers they had much more rigid bones, which helped them move around easier. As we move through the Mesozoic era, you're going to see a lot more updates with them, so stay tuned for that. Alright, the last group I want to introduce you to is one that ended up taking on a form that we're pretty familiar with in our own oceans today, the Ichthyosaurs, who would eventually become the dolphins of the Mesozoic, hundreds of millions of years before dolphins even thought of existing. This is yet another ideal body form that has worked for multiple lineages, and for the marine reptiles, it allowed them to make it through at least one mass extinction, and potentially 2. There's some new updates. Ichthyosaurs were initially thought to have evolved during this post-Permian mass extinction radiation that we have been talking about for the entire video. But in 2023, on a remote Arctic island called Svalbard, scientists found the remains of the earliest ichthyosaurs that we know of, in rocks that date to the late Permian period. And not like on its way to the ichthyosaur form. No, a fully marine ichthyosaur. Absolutely sick development if you ask me. With this new evidence, that means that ichthyosaurs not only survived the Triassic mass extinction, that we're about to get to, but it also survived the Permian extinction. 2 catastrophic mass extinctions survived. Clearly, they have an ideal body form. And that's not the only new development in the ichthyosaur community. Actually, the biggest one was just announced this year. I talked about it in a short, but now I'll talk about it in this alone. So, in May 2020, 11-year-old Ruby Reynolds came across a jawbone while on the beach with her dad in the UK. It was massive, and turned out to belong to a Triassic ichthyosaur. Based on analysis that was just announced this year, turns out it was not only the largest ichthyosaur that we know of, but the largest marine reptile to ever exist, that we know of. It's now called Ichthyotitan savernensis, and it got to the size of a blue whale. The largest ichthyosaurs known before Ichthyotitan were in a group called Shastasaurus. Similar vibe, and estimated to have gotten to about 70 feet long. Ichthyotitan blew them right out of the water, with an estimated length of 82 feet long, which is about the size of an average blue whale. Not the biggest, so they're not the biggest to ever exist, because now Pterosaurs got fucked as well. Blue whale is still the biggest to ever exist, that we know of. The Triassic was clearly a time of experimentation of all shapes and sizes, and this was the only period that these behemoths existed, because the mass extinction at the end of this period, well, overshadowed by the Permian and the Cretaceous, was still powerful enough to decimate ecosystems of all kinds, and led to the extinction of the large ichthyosaurs and up to 76% of all species on the planet, about 201 million years ago. So, Just to recap, 50 million years before this, Permian mass extinction, most devastating of all time. 16 million years after that, Permian pluvial episode. And then 30-ish million years after that, we had another mass extinction, and lost 76% of all species that have been dragging their way out of disaster. So what caused this one? What the fuck was wrong now? Take a swift guess. Yeah, volcanic activity. Remember how I mentioned that at the end of this period, Pangea was starting to break apart? Well, looks like at the area where modern-day North America and Africa began to separate, it set off a chain reaction of first, a massive outpouring of lava that lasted for like 620,000 years, and resulted in overall lava coverage of 10 million square kilometers over central Pangea. This led to a massive release of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, reduced oxygens in oceans all around the world, which suffocated both marine and terrestrial life, just as the world was entering what would eventually be known as the true reign of the dinosaurs. So what does this mean for them? I think it's easy to imagine them as a lineage that rose to dominance through competition, annihilating their competitors, etc. But that wasn't really the case. They rose to dominance through opportunity and having the right set of traits to survive devastating extinction events, and they would emerge as arguably the most successful group of all time. They spread the fuck out and were the key components of ecosystems in multiple different levels for over 150 million years. And if we consider sauropods as a whole, including marine reptiles and pterosaurs, there's just absolutely no room for debate, and we'll be covering that next time, along with how other groups were handling this superpower. Of course, I can't leave out the little guys, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss that. Also, if you enjoyed how long this video was, let me know by liking and commenting. I would appreciate it. Thank you so much for Paleo Analysis for coming on. Check out his channel that I linked in the description. Keep up with behind the scenes content and our Discord server on my Patreon. And for now, stay curious. The world has a lot for us to learn. See ya!